Now, when I say Nemo, it conjures something in your mind, doesn't it?
Whoa!
Nemo!
No, wrong. Not the Disney animated fish movie, damn it. When someone mentions Nemo, certain images come to mind.
And I think that's what we're doing at Nemo, is trying to spend our lives in the most fulfilling way possible.
No, that is not what comes to mind when someone says Nemo camping gear. No.
I'm your host with the most, Finding Nemo, aka Nemo Hoes, and today, oh my God.
Oh my god, Captain Nemo, Scourge of the High Seas, enemy to colonizers, captain of the Nautilus, Captain Nemo! Yeah, well, that Captain Nemo is actually connected to some really great and historical moments in cinematic history, like the pioneering of the first underwater photography over 100 years ago, the fact that the first adaptation was directed by the first director that ever there was. Nemo's connected to big names, both in casting and directing, special effects auteurs, and across all mediums: TV, movie, video games, comics, novels. He runs the gamut.
How? What? Why?
Well, the character of Nemo was created by novelist Jules Verne and featured in just 2 novels, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and The Mysterious Island. And there was a cameo in a stage play that is really fairly unimportant and only mentioned here for purposes of thoroughness.
After all, you know everything, don't you?
Well, I don't know everything, but I am doing my best. I'm trying to put on a show here. Now, over the next 5 chapters, I'm going to attempt to cover everything in the cinematic world that relates to Jules Verne's Captain Nemo. By the end of this series, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what is Nemo about? What's his philosophy? We'll learn about a few different moments in film history touched by Verne's pirate philosopher. You'll know which adaptations that you might want to check out, as well as having a pretty good idea of what other versions of Nemo have appeared over the decades.
Can you do all those things?
Well, we're going to try. In this chapter, we're going to take a brief look at Jules Verne to understand the context of when Nemo was created and why that's relevant to modern science fiction, as well as establishing the intended character of Nemo and his own fictional backstory and motivations, and then we'll finish up with a quick breakdown of what to expect from the upcoming chapters. Now let's start with, who is Jules Verne and why is he important?
Got a picture?
That's the guy.
So, what do you know about this guy?
Well, some have called him the father of science fiction. That's pretty heavy.
Yeah, I was impressed.
Right? I mean, Jules himself downplayed the credit, and I can see why. But I can also see why he deserves it nonetheless.
What are you talking about?
Well, consider that Verne was the first generation born after the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution went from 1760 to 1820 or 1840, about there. And during that time, advances in textiles, meaning how clothing was created and manufactured, as well as machine tools and steam power, allowed cheaper and easier production of iron, and basically everybody's standards of living increased. Well, you know, the white ones anyway. The story of colonialism sort of springboards out of the Industrial Revolution and then wreaks havoc on indigenous peoples the world over, but I don't really think that this is the right time to go into it.
I've never met anybody yet who thought the timing was right.
Actually, there is some colonialism embedded into Nemo's backstory. It is his backstory, and I intend to get into it in just a moment, but I don't want to lose this thread.
Fine, whatever.
Okay, let's make it quick. The Industrial Revolution ends in about 1840. Verne was born in 1828, right at the tail end. Similar to a child being born after smartphones and Wi-Fi, their outlook is going to be impacted by those innovations that were once a revolution and now are just part of our daily life. Still, he was riding a crest of a wave of innovation. So when he sees some of the first hot air balloons, he envisions Around the World in 80 Days, or Mysterious Island, or 5 Weeks in a Balloon. This dude had a real thing for hot air balloons. And when he saw his first model of a real submarine, it inspired his writing of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And he was way ahead of the curve on space travel in From the Earth to the Moon.
That's a keen and brilliant observation, sir.
Well, I just mean, the guy was born almost 200 years ago, when all these cool inventions were being made at a time when the world was still full of mystery and unknown lands, full of interesting exotic plants and animals, and that's kind of the crux of Verne and his sci-fi roots, the misconception he might feel of his work. At heart, Verne was a marine biologist.
Marine biologist?
Yes.
All right, well, maybe just a biologist? A nature enthusiast? His 20,000 leagues were a measure of distance, not depth. That's a common misconception. It was how far they traveled in the submarine, and he used his pages to talk about all the undersea life that he saw. The only reason his novels included hot air balloons was a means to an end, to get his characters over the jungles to exotic locations and see the animals. Am I just babbling here now?
No. That actually makes sense to me.
Okay, good. Look, the controversy around the validity of whether or not Verne was doing the right science fiction, or if he even was trying to, is immaterial to me. If by accident he predicted spaceflight, or whether he inspired people who would one day do these things, it doesn't really matter. He did inspire people. He is still inspiring people to this day. And his stories are still told and emulated in all kinds of other media like Lost or Mist or Fate Grand Order or League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. People love Verne, even if they don't realize where it comes from.
I hate people.
Now, I know that life is fast-paced and people have no patience and just want me to get to it. So, these are the two that you should watch. It's pretty obvious. The 1954 Disney version and the 1961 Ray Harryhausen version. They're the gold standard, really. They're classics, they're fun for the whole family. So that's it. Off you go. It's not right, is it? No. That's fine. That's for tourists, right? If you just want to touch base, check it out, one and done, see the movie, you know what we're talking about, that's cool. Off into the next thing. These are the two that you want to see. But that's not what we do here, all right? So prepare yourself for a deep dive into all things Nemo. In 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, Nemo gives very little of his backstory. Shrouded in mystery and intrigue, even his name Nemo is derived from the Latin word for nobody.
I am no one.
Captain Nemo.
That means no one in Latin.
Quite so.
So who is he? Legit, I think he could be the original Punisher. From Marvel?
Yeah, but that's impossible.
Okay, follow me on this. In the second novel, The Mysterious Island, Nemo tells us his backstory, which is very sad. His family was murdered during a civil uprising, and he has bent his life on vengeance ever since.
And making much too much of it, if you ask me.
So both of their families were slaughtered, and then they began lifelong vendettas against the perpetrators. In Frank Castle's case, it was organized crime. In Nemo's case, it was the British colonial forces. The Punisher had his battle van and generally lived in the sewers underground. Nemo had his submarine, the Nautilus, and he stayed below the surface, evading the laws of man and planning his next move.
That's uncanny. That is, you got him down pat.
Now, I'm not saying that the Punisher and Nemo are directly linked, though I do think in the literary lineage of vigilantes, Nemo is certainly an excellent archetype for what the Punisher became. Most cinematic vigilantes begin in the 70s with Dirty Harry, part of the cynical mood of Vietnam and the death of Kennedy. Other vigilantes in literature that predate Nemo, like Robin Hood, the Scarlet Pimpernel, didn't have missions that censored on vengeance and murder. Did they?
No, as far as I know, no.
Yeah. Well, and the Count of Monte Cristo or Captain Blood had a single person or small group of people to revenge against, while Frank Castle and Nemo's wars are endless, as is the fight against organized crime or the festering carcass of colonialism.
Well, what can you do? Tears me up sometimes.
Well, as we'll see in the upcoming chapters, the cinematic history of Nemo spans over a century in film, engaging the creators of the day and inspiring every generation since.
Naturally.
And he was played by many of the great actors of the day, like Omar Sharif, Michael Caine, James Mason, Herbert Lom, Patrick Stewart, and Yeah, that's a whole lot of white guys, which brings us to the issue of race.
A race? He's a race. I hope I win.
Different kind of race, actually, and I don't think you're going to be able to predict where this is going.
You have something on your mind?
Now, when I thought about doing this episode, I thought it would be fun to get like a captain's hat, like James Mason in the 1954 version, but considering Nemo is South Asian, that would seem to be somewhat inappropriate. In 20,000 Leagues, the book, Nemo isn't identified as being from India, but he is in the sequel, The Mysterious Island, which solidifies that into canon. Nemo is named as Prince Dakar, the son of a Hindu Raja. Now, his family was slaughtered during the Indian rebellion of Navesi. This is the same rebellion referenced in Temple of Doom, by the way. You remember this?
Captain Blumbert was just telling me something of the interesting history of the palace, the importance it played in the mutiny.
It seems the British never forget the mutiny of 1857.
Well, the reason why Captain Blumbert is so Blumhurt is because this mutiny is called the War of Independence by the other side. So let's take a minute to flesh that out. I'm not an expert, but it's worth at least a quick glance since this is the origin story of our anti-hero.
Well, sir, it was just something that happened. It was sort of an accident.
Well, I think we could do a little better than that. It lasted a full year. Britain recoiled in horror as 6,000 of a total of 40,000 Britons in India were killed. And that would be atrocious and outrageous if it weren't for the 800,000 Indians that died in the fighting, as well as famine and disease in that same time period. And that only matters because it's the British East India Company that was basically a giant corporation running the country with almost complete disregard for their customs and cultures. Indian soldiers were treated differently than the white ones. Oil used on ammunition could have animal fat, which countered their religious beliefs. And it's a long list of issues that brought about the rebellion and really horrible atrocities committed on either side. But it wasn't the native people of India who were in power.
White people, am I right?
It's not a big surprise that these older movies made more offensive racist mistakes because they were of a time when racism was more prevalent.
It's an awful sort of thing.
And I don't want to have to keep saying, here's another old white guy playing a South Asian man, or do that greasy-ass move where I just pretend not to see color and ignore race entirely and just erase the ethnicity of the character, which, of course, is what they did in some of these movies. But let's just get it all out of the way and out in the open now, and I'll just tell you why it bothers me less than it otherwise would.
All right, I'll lay it out for you.
Now, when Verne was writing 20,000 Leagues, he conceived Nemo as a Polish scientist whose acts of vengeance were directed against the Russians who had killed his family in the January uprising. Oh, no, I can see how that would be confusing. The January uprising actually took place in 1863 in Poland, although that was about an Eastern European country that was trying to throw off Russian occupation. No reason for that to be relevant now. I just don't think that the racial identity of Nemo in this case is central to the character as intended, which is to throw off imperialism and wrestling with vengeance or moving on to find some kind of peace. Those elements don't change. Obviously, it would be nice for this legendary character to be represented as he was in the book, but considering that Verne hated the change he had to make for this publisher, who was concerned about offending Russian readers, we can say that the ethnicity wasn't the foremost integral part of his identity. So in 20,000 Leagues, he chose to erase his backstory entirely and make his past a mystery. And it wasn't until he wrote Mysterious Island 4 years later that he gave Nemo's origin story.
That's a good point.
Alright, so now that I don't have to keep pointing out every time that all these white dudes are playing an Indian guy, let's talk about his ship. I keep mentioning his ride, the submarine called Nautilus. It features in both novels, but largely is the focus of 20,000 Leagues. Verne's sub ran on electricity, and it often has a fish-like quality to its design to possibly emulate a sea monster that's been taking down ships. And there are many variations, some adhering to the book's description of a cigar-like shape with a ramming spike on one end, and some of the less creative productions have been pretty blunt about just inexplicably making it a modern-looking sub 200 years before they existed. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Verne had based his ship off a model he saw in 1867, the very real ship, the Plunger. Now, I'm sure the French will pronounce it all slick like Plunger, but I see the Plunger. means diver in French. And I wanted to see if this was true and if everybody in France was using divers when the toilet got clogged. But will you look at that? So they gotta say they gotta go pissed in the toilet, which actually I guess it makes sense, right? But anyway. A nautilus is a kind of shell, but Verne chose the name because it was also the name of the very first submarine ever built in 1800. The first real-life Nautilus was man-powered, actually used a big corkscrew in the middle of it, hand-cranked, for the propeller, and it made it about 4 hours underwater. But the plunger was under mechanical power, using compressed air to power a rotor. It could only dive about 10 meters, and it reached a top speed of 9 kilometers, but that's all that was needed to open up new possibilities in Verne's imagination. It became the perfect device that he could use in a story to deliver a detailed tour of marine life like Tolkien wrote about walking.
They walk, 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 walk. Somebody's following them. Walk, walk.
Some of the fun of the ship is in the ornate designs, not only on the exterior of the ship that's supposed to be mistaken for a sea monster, but also the set designs inside, which can be some of the most lavish and lush to this day ever created. I'll try and show as many nautili as I can as we go.
Nautilus?
Nautiloy. It's 8 for now.
Now, Nemo's ship is both a fierce war machine when he wishes it to be, but it's also a luxury ship where every meal is entirely eco-friendly.
These dishes come entirely from my ocean kitchen. There is nothing here of the earth. That is fillet of sea snake. That is brisket of blowfish with sea squirt dressing, basted in barnacles. The cream is, of course, milk from the giant sperm whale.
The crew put on suits and they harvest what they need from the ocean floors. Diving suits featured in both stories, but we see much more explicit scenes underwater in 20,000 Leagues, which was a feat in and of itself in the burgeoning medium of film at the turn of the century, as we will see in Chapter 2. So we have a pretty good understanding of Jules Verne. The French novelist wrote adventure novels and is credited as being the father of science fiction and the possible creator of the steampunk aesthetic. He wrote Nemo in 2 novels, who is a pirate, philosopher, scientist in his own right, sailing under the seas in his submarine the Nautilus above the laws of man and raging against colonialism. Now, looking forward ahead at the other chapters in the series, Chapter 2 will cover all the adaptations of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Chapter 3 is going to cover every adaptation of The Mysterious Island. Chapter 4 will be all of the Nemo movies and TV series that were not based off Jules Verne, original stories, somewhat. And Chapter 5 is going to be left as something of a surprise. Why? Well, because I was once told that happiness is having something to look forward to. Like when I see your likes and your comments. See you next week.